Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on a Tuesday evening. I know we're probably all quite busy with midterms and all other obligations, but I'm really excited to have you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam. I'm a second-year MALD, and I'm leading Pride at Fletcher this year. So we have a wonderful panel for you all. You'll be hearing from our lovely moderator, Jamie, and we're going to start with some opening remarks from Dean Kite in honor of LGBTQ+ History Month.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to everybody in Fletcher Pride. So I'm pleased to be here. I'm really interested in the discussion. I might have to slip out slightly before the end, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. So I think, this month, I think it's really appropriate that we sort of discuss history and everything that's brought us to this moment in time. But it's also important and interesting that we talk to the specifics of how we live our lives, how the queer community can stitch together careers in international affairs in a world where in many countries, in many societies, the act of being queer, of showing up queer is a challenge, is illegal, is an act which may bring you into a difficult situation, violence, etc. And so there are plenty of people out there building careers. We've got some of the people in this room today will have been responsible for changing the rules and bending the rules for how people can build those careers. And so what I think is interesting is that much of the career advice that I give is, your career is not a straight line. You're gonna go. It's going to undulate at best. Sometimes you're going to peel off and do different things. Most of you will have portfolio careers where you'll do many different things in very different organizations or spaces through the course of your career. That's now the new normal for career development, but it's also then there's new and uncharted navigable waters if you're doing that as a queer person as well. And so how do we understand all of that? So there's no one way to do it. Fabrice has had one career. All of our speakers have had careers. Fabrice and I worked together at one point at the World Bank when we were both employees there. And he can talk very eloquently about his own journey, but also the things that he's done subsequently to make this possible for so many other people. The only thing I would say is that some of my early career history feels almost prehistoric, given how far some parts of the world have come, but other parts of the world haven't. And it was interesting to sort of have to go back into the closet in order to undertake certain parts of your job. It was interesting to have to come out on a daily basis, it felt sometimes, as part of your job. It was interesting to understand how much you were internalizing decisions about what you would and wouldn't do, which jobs you would and would not apply for, because of the way you wanted to be able to live your life and the freedom you wanted to be able to enjoy. And it was interesting to know when that factored in and when it didn't. And in the moment, I'm not sure I was very conscious about a lot of the decisions I made, but on reflection, you can see the impact that that has had, which is why I'm so pleased to be here today. So we're not here to talk about my personal career story, just to say that you can pursue a career in international affairs and be queer. And more and more people are doing that, and more people are finding each other and finding informal networks of solidarity, as well as formal networks of solidarity, as well as changing the rules of international organizations and governments so that your international career can be fully enjoyed. And of course, the private sector has played a very important role in pushing the boundaries of that. Consulting firms in the first instances, and some big companies, we've got one with us today, but also now increasingly smaller firms as this becomes better understood. But it's one thing to be a corporate executive in a multinational that embraces this issue. I do some work with General Atlantic, the private equity fund. We had a huge coming out day and sort of celebration of careers last week with Lord John Brown, who used to be the CEO of British Petroleum. And I was talking to one of the investment officers who's pursuing a number of investments in emerging markets in Southeast Asia and in Muslim countries in Southeast Asia. And he was like, okay, I can't quite believe that I'm part of this conversation, and I don't know how to talk about this event back with my team where I'm working. So we live in these 2-speed worlds, 3, 4, 5-speed worlds, but today is an important way to explore with people who've got a lot to say about how to build a career. So Jenny, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dean Kite, my mic's working, for that introduction. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. My name is Jamie Fry, and I use they, them pronouns. And I am privileged to introduce our distinguished panelists today, as well as moderate tonight's discussion. First, we recognize that this panel lacks the critical perspectives of queer and trans people of color, the communities that were and continue to be the foundation of queer liberation in this country. Pride at Fletcher feels this absence acutely, and we look forward to rectifying this absence at future events. Before I introduce our panelists, let me explain briefly the structure of tonight's event. First, each panelist will have about 5 minutes to share a brief reflection on the theme of tonight's discussion, which is navigating careers as a member of the LGBTQ community with a focus on international relations. Then I prepared a few questions for our panelists, and at 6:30, we'll transition to audience Q&A, ending promptly at 6:45. I know you all have important places to be tonight. Now, let me introduce our panelists and a few of their many accomplishments. Do we have our 2 panelists on Zoom? Or are we waiting? All right, excellent. So I'm going to introduce on Zoom Fabrice Oudard. Fabrice is Executive Director and founder of the Association of LGBTQ+ Corporate Directors. He also advises Fortune 500 companies and is a member of the L'Oreal Global Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, as well as an advisor of the National Association of Corporate Directors Center for Inclusive Governance. Fabrice was previously an officer at the United Nations and at the World Bank. He also volunteers on the boards of Outright Action International, Housing Works, Fondation Emergence, Trans New York, Witness to Mass Incarceration, the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, and the Institute of Current World Affairs, and is an advisor to Open for Business. Now we also have another panelist here with us in person, and this is Tim Atherton. Tim is an associate professor of physics right here at Tufts University. His research encompasses the physics of materials as well as physics education around computation and inclusive learning environments. Tim is the co-author of the first ever peer-reviewed study of LGBT+ climate in physics, just published this year. He served on the American Physical Society's task force on LGBT+ issues in physics and was the Out to Innovate GLBT Educator of the Year in 2014. Tim is also a recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award and the Research Corporation for Science Advancement Cottrell Award for his work in integrating research and education. Thank you so much to both our panelists for being here with us tonight, and we hope that we have a third panelist joining us, at which point I will introduce her. Now, I was hoping we could get started with our statements. Tim, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Dean Kite, for the remarks. And it's just absolutely thrilling to be here at the Fletcher School. As you'll hear from my voice, like many of you, I'm from another country. And you know, one of the sort of remarkable things about the world of physics, although it's a little different from international relations, is that it's truly a global enterprise. In my daily life, I'm interacting with people from every continent, pretty much every part of the world. And that to me has been one of the true joys of being a physicist. It's an absolutely essential part. It wasn't easy moving to another country and trying to find a job, actually. So I think that's something that another place where we can resonate. It was particularly difficult as a queer person, you know, who'd had relatively good experiences in my original country, moving as it was to Ohio. where I just wasn't sure what the environment was going to be. I'm very grateful to say it was actually rather positive overall, but actually very challenging. And so, you know, as I've talked to many people about these issues over the years, you know, my trajectory really came from, if you'd approached me in 2008 when I was a postdoc, you know, and said, what does your queerness have to do with your physics? I would have said, well, really nothing. I mean, you know, I'm doing my physics in the day, and I'm going home and doing whatever I like, partying, you know, etc. You know, at night. But then I began to realize that actually these two worlds were not distinct, and I wasn't really able to do my best science and participate fully in my professional career if I wasn't able to bring who I was as a queer person to the workplace and be comfortable there. And so, you know, I started kind of, you know, sort of thinking about these things. And when I attended conferences, you know, myself and other like-minded people started asking things like, well, how come there's no support for queer physicists? You know, at the time, I wasn't even sure there were any, to be absolutely honest. At the end of the very first class I ever taught, a student emailed me to say, thank you, Professor Atherton, for being out. I'd never had an out professor. And, you know, my reaction to that was really like, what? I didn't know I was out, you know, like, you know, I guess I was setting fire to things, you know, as I passed them. But, you know, my reaction was that I wasn't sure, I hadn't realized I was out. But my second reaction was that I wanted every student to have that experience. I wanted every student to feel comfortable and included in my classroom. And I began to realize, you know, as challenging as physics is, and oh my goodness, is it challenging? We are using powerful computers, advanced mathematics, machines that that cost a fortune and are geopolitically very interesting, you know, because they represent international collaborations in all sorts of ways. We have, oh my goodness, is physics challenging, but even more challenging, in fact, are people, I think, and understanding them. And I realized that I needed to bring the same level of intellectual rigor to understanding queer experiences in physics and physics education that I did to bring to my regular research. This became a pattern for me, and my wonderful co-authors were a group of people representing many kinds of institutions, many places across the country. And, you know, we began to do things like systematic surveys of people, you know, people at various career stages. We prepared a report for the American Physical Society with recommendations that has had a lot of, I think has gained a lot of traction. The APS has started to do things very differently at their conferences, has brought in new institutional structures to help support queer people. And as you kindly mentioned, you know, we were able to get this, this research into a peer-reviewed journal, a very challenging task. You know, many of the reviewers said, well, why are we even publishing this? You know, so very challenging. And so, you know, I think my trajectory has been, you know, very exciting. I think that being queer has, you know, given me unique skills and assets that have actually made me a better physicist and a better educator. I see queerness as providing unique resources that we can all draw upon to do our jobs better. And, you know, my sort of offering from the world of STEM to the rest of us is that, like, bringing both quantitative and qualitative perspectives, bringing intellectual rigor to these questions of climate and inclusion, I think is a very powerful approach that can help catalyze change.
Thank you so much for those words, Tim. I think a lot of us can relate to the slow realization that our identity actually intersects a lot with our work, and that becomes that much more important to us and what we do. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Fabrice. If you're on Zoom and want to give your opening statement, we'd appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate, and thank you for the introduction. You know, I feel a lot like like Rachel mentioned, a dinosaur, because I think things have changed a lot since I first had a career in international relations, which started in year 2000, and the situation was very different. People at the World Bank and the United Nations were careful sometimes about not disclosing their sexual orientation, and benefits were not equal. In fact, I remember at the World Bank, people had to choose between their career and their spouse. There was no visa for spouses. So the reason I say that is that, first of all, my experience, I work at the World Bank for 14 years, and I work in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN for 4 years, is probably becoming more and more irrelevant because we are making strides constantly. Now, this is not to say that it remains easy, because, I love to say that we are guests of straight people in those organizations, meaning that we still very often are not represented in upper management. Rachel was an openly gay vice president at the World Bank, senior vice president at the World Bank. That was very rare, and I think it's still very rare today. When I was at the United Nations, I could not really figure out if there was any out assistant secretary, and I don't think that there is a completely out assistant secretary. So that would be my first point, right? Which is to say that things have evolved a lot, but they are still a bit difficult. We are still very underrepresented in senior management in those institutions. The second aspect, and it's kind of echoing what you said about the diversity of the panelists tonight, is that indeed I came to the United States in order to come out. I felt I could not come out at home, and I was an immigrant, but I was extremely privileged. I'm a man, I am white, I was educated, and even though it was difficult coming out in business, I prefer not to imagine what was the experience of the trans woman that worked at the IMF briefly when I was in Washington, DC, meaning that it's always easier when you have some elements of privilege. My experience was very similar to what was just described, in the sense that at the beginning, I felt I had to hide my sexual orientation and gender identity. My father had told me, you should never come out, and you will not have a career if people know you're gay. And then little by little, I started feeling slightly more comfortable by joining the employee resource group in coming out. I will tell you a little story, which is that I had a director at the bank, maybe in my second assignment, and every time we would have a party, a celebration, he would say, next we would celebrate Fabrice's engagement, and he meant engagement to a girl. Clearly, he was not very perceptive, and it took me 2 years to finally tell him, look, we're not going to celebrate my engagement. I'm gay. We cannot get married. And after that, of course, he stopped. But I was afraid. And the last thing I would say is that when I finally became very visible by talking about my sexual orientation and my experience and my family, is when for the first time I felt the burden of shame being transferred from my shoulder to the shoulder of my colleagues at the World Bank. And that's the moment I found some level of self-confidence. I love to say that, my first 8 years at the bank, when my turn would come to speak, I would blush and I would sweat because I had internalized the fact that I was an inferior species. And it's only the moment where I started taking ownership of who I was that I felt more confident. But thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Fabrice. That was very moving to hear. Now, I'm wondering, do we have our third panelist also on Zoom at the moment? No. Okay. In that case, we'll move forward with, I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about with just the two excellent people in the room tonight. So I'm going to start off with just a general question to get the ball rolling for both of you. What are the biggest challenges of being an out member of the LGBTQ community in your profession? And how do you navigate those challenges? What advice can you give to the students in this room? Whoever wants to take this one first, feel free.
You want to go ahead, Fabrice?
And I actually wonder, can we get gallery mode on Zoom? That would be wonderful. I would love to see everyone's faces. Thank you.
That's so mean, you know. I was hoping that you would start.
Sorry, no hiding in this room.
You know, I have to tell you that, you know, of course now I am, you know, I lead a nonprofit that is very focused on LGBT issues, and so there is no, you know, in a way I made it easier for myself by being in an organization where I interact with a lot of LGBTQ plus people. I think the biggest challenge I faced when I was at the World Bank and the United Nations is that straight people and cisgender people would often say, well, what are they complaining about? You know, sometimes they would not express it, but they would think it. You know, we have the right policy in place. You know, at least it happened after 2010. We do not discriminate, right? We do not harass you. And still you're saying that you need us to constantly celebrate you. You know, what is the issue? And the issue is very subtle, right? And very often now people talk about inclusion and belonging, you know, and what I think is that it's very difficult if you have not had the experience of discrimination to understand it. And I say that, and I'm very conscious that I do not understand the experience of discrimination of women. I do not understand the experience of discrimination of people of color. You know, I will tell you, one day I was seated next to a managing director of the World Bank called Caroline Anstey. And I was sharing with her that story of always feeling self-conscious at a review meeting that my voice mattered less and that I was an inferior species. And she said, you describe exactly what it is to be a woman at the World Bank. And I was baffled because I had never thought for a minute, you know, about the experience of a woman in what remained a very male-dominated environment. You know, I also, you know, recently had, you know, heard a woman, an African-American woman on television say, I am afraid when my children go out that they would encounter the police. Well, you know, I have two little boys and, you know, that are white as snow, and I don't really perceive the police as a threat to them, right? My experience makes it very difficult for me to understand the experience of marginalized community until they really verbalize it. And so I think that, you know, at the World Bank and the United Nations, a lot of people felt that our complaints were not legitimate, right? And our complaints were, we do not always feel like we belong. And the reason is because we do not magically drop our experience in society when we come in the workplace. Meaning that if society has told us that as women we are less valuable, we do not magically forget about that message we heard in childhood when we come to the workplace. If society has told us that as gay people, we are a danger to family and tradition, and that we are less reliable and we are frivolous, we do not magically forget it when we come in the workplace. And in a way, it is the responsibility of the workplace to make sure that we get the memo that we are welcome and we belong.
Thank you, Fabrice. Tim, do you have thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Fabrice, for that really helpful perspective. So I think I would sort of say that one of the challenges that I encounter as an academic is that we kind of all assume that academia is this really progressive, like left-wing kind of place, you know, and that somehow, you know, we're all cool, right? And yet, you know, I've encountered homophobia. You know, I have a couple of senior faculty in my field, not at this institution, who, when they learned I was gay, they didn't want to talk to me anymore. It's kind of a shame. They still haven't, you know. I've had faculty at this institution, when I started talking about my husband or queer issues, shut the door, you know. And I want to echo, I want to echo Fabrice's point that, like, you know, there are plenty of other people who have it so much worse. These are very minor things. Of course, they weren't that minor in the context of tenure, but, you know, they were still pretty minor. So one of the other problems, and I think this is where I would absolutely parallel what Fabrice is saying, is like, what's the problem? Is kind of one of the questions that I think everyone has. And there's assumption that there can be a problem because somehow, you know, we're all great in academia, right? So that's been one thing I've had to do in my work, is rigorously and carefully try to highlight with data, qualitative data, quantitative data, experiences, conversations, really highlight what are the problems, right? Really push those, really make them so visible that any reasonable person who's willing to look at the data can't disagree that there's kind of a problem. So that's been one thing. And, you know, I've had a lot of pushback for that. You know, when I first started doing all this, this research, you know, people are like, well, why are you doing this? Right? Like, why are you wasting time? Why aren't you doing your physics stuff? And I said, well, you know, for me, this is really important. You know, if this is the change that I am destined to help make, that feels very important to me. You know, if I told you that I was going to church every week or synagogue or gurdwara, you would not question it. You had better not question it, right? That's what this is taking. This is taking an hour of my week, right? So don't ask me, you know? So I think that's been one thing. I think the corollary to that, though, is as soon as you are out along any axis of marginalization at all, oh my God, suddenly do you ask to get done a whole bunch of things. You know, like you are on every committee, you are on every kind of consultation. You know, your presence is requested, but your voice is actually not always that popular. You know, one of the things I often encounter is that, you know, I'm a pretty nice guy overall, but there's a stereotype about how gay men are supposed to behave and interact that, you know, if I'm offering difficult feedback to organizations that are discriminatory or not doing what they should be or not fulfilling their mission, you know, I'm often, amazingly enough, perceived as intimidating or confrontational or read in ways that, you know, at the same time, you know, my straight male colleagues are shouting at each other and no one has a problem with that. So that's been kind of another thing, acting up in a way that didn't match what people exactly wanted from me, you know, has always been kind of an issue. So I think those are some of the challenges. You know, I think it is kind of, but I also want to just briefly say there's the joys, you know, the joy of being an academic is being able to think freely about things with relatively little pressure, to be able to educate people and play a part in helping them achieve their full selves. You know, how could I do that if I wasn't willing to engage with their many kinds of identity? You know, so that to me is just an immeasurable, profound joy, you know. And, you know, I was at North Carolina State last week to give a colloquium, and we had I always meet with the students without the faculty present. There was a student there, and he just came out, and we were the first people he'd ever came out to. And he said, like, I've never come out to anyone, but by the way, you know. And I thought that was just so beautiful. It was a moment that was just profoundly beautiful, that I had the opportunity to be there for. reminded me of kind of my own process, you know. So that is the reason that despite all these challenges, I'm still here and I'm still fighting for queer people in science.
Wow, that's so great, Tim. I wanted to ask you, I have a follow-up. How do you balance being so emotionally invested and engaged in these issues in your work, often in contentious environments, but also making sure to protect your own mental health, your own well-being? How do you strike that right balance? I'm sure a lot of people are struggling with this as well. I know I am.
That's a great question. And I should say there are many things that are, where all of us are facing huge headwinds that are not trying to help us protect our mental health. You know, like I'm constantly asked to be on committees, to do extra uncompensated work, to kind of show up to something, you know, not nearly as wonderful as this event, but, you know, constantly being bombarded with requests. So first things first, you have to learn to say no professionally and courteously, and in a way that is beneficial for everybody. You know, when I was a more junior member of the faculty, I learned to say, you know, like, I really love this project. I'm super interested in it, and I appreciate that you thought of me, but this is not the kind of thing I can be dedicating my time till until I have tenure, right? And, you know, most people were like, understood, you know? And so that thing is learning to say no professionally. Second thing is creating separation. Like I used to live over on Sunset Avenue, just behind Tufts when I was an assistant professor. It was an absolutely wonderful thing. I could walk to work, great, 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 great. Now I live in downtown Boston. And that commute between Boston and Medford just allows me to kind of have, you know, I'm like, I'm going home. I'm coming to work. It allows me to kind of put my professional spheres in place. And the third thing is, I think, being very focused about your working hours. You know, my partner is a director at a large company. He's tremendously successful, also has a PhD, you know, has made a lot of money out of his work. You know, he got into data science at the right time, before it was like super popular. And he doesn't work outside 9 to 5. And when I started observing this, I was like, but Patrick, you don't do anything outside 9 to 5. And he said, well, why would I need to? You know, I can do all of that. This was baffling to me. You know, in academia, we do not have this work thing. It may not be possible for you to take such a stance. Totally get it, right? You're in a program where that just may not be possible. But I think it's still a good idea to have clear boundaries in your time, in your physical space, you know. And the final thing that helps me is like, I put on my calendar, I block out an hour 2 to 3 times a week to go to the gym and lift weights, which is what makes me happy and allows me to get my stress out. That could be something completely different for you, running, exercise, playing a sport, but some kind of activity that is just not in your regular headspace, is in a different headspace. So those are all of my tips. I hope those are actionable, but.
Yeah, I mean, hearing those tips is fabulous. Putting them into practice is a little bit harder, but we will certainly try. Fabrice, did you want to weigh in on this question as well?
Well, I don't really take good care of my mental health, I have to say. You know, that's funny because when you were speaking, I was listening. You know, I have to say, I don't want to be rude. I was listening, but I was also ordering 5 guys for me and my children for tonight. And because, you know, I was like, you know what, I don't have the energy of cooking. I'm going to order 5 guys, and I feel very guilty about it. My son said a few days ago, he said, why don't you buy a cookbook? Which I think was a criticism of my cooking, a veiled criticism. But I will tell you, I'm extremely passionate about my job, and I'm very lucky because it overlaps with my passion. Right? I had that weird experience, that sexual orientation was the biggest defining element of my life. And I don't think this is going to happen for the next generations, right? I think little by little in urban areas, hopefully beyond white gay men, it will become less and less important, and your personality, your character might be more determinant of what happened in your life than your sexual orientation. But for me, it was a very defining element. And so having the chance to work on this topic, right, better the understanding of what is the gay and trans experience in our world, and also advance the goals of our community through my nonprofit engagement, but also through my engagement with corporations and at the World Bank and the United Nations. That has been such a blessing, because it helped me make sense of my life, make sense of that strange life in which I had to leave my family and my community, and I felt I was not a worthy individual for a great part of my life. Now I find worth, of course, in that engagement. And I have to say, I was very blessed. I had children, and I have found a lot of the worth I crave for in being a father too.
Wow. I mean, I would say that ordering Five Guys, that's a form of self-care, giving yourself a little time off in the night.
Now in New York, it's 55.
Okay. Now, another question I want to turn to, which is one of my favorite questions that's always asked in panels. What advice would you give your younger self, specifically about how to navigate your identity in the workplace? I feel I always pull the best lessons from this.
I love it. That's such a good question. And, and I would love to come back and talk to myself when I was 16. And what I would tell myself is, do not be afraid. So many of my decisions were driven by fear. The fear that, the fear of what would my parents say when I would come out? The fear of not having a career, the fear of getting fired from my job at the World Bank, the fear of that things would not work out. And in retrospect, every time I fell, things were crashing and that my life was falling into pieces, my life was actually falling into place, right? What I perceived as a setback that would destroy me, right? That I would feel so frustrated about was actually the best thing that happened to me. And there is something that I love is that quote of Saint Teresa of Avila. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it says, more tears have been shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones. And to me, in retrospect, that was so true, right? That everything I wanted or I thought I wanted was not exactly what would be good for me. And I remember, Rachel might have a smile in thinking about it, is that when I left the bank, I was terrified. I thought there was no life after the bank, but there was actually a life after the bank, and I had no idea, right? And I find that if I could redo my life, I would drop the fear, because I made so many bad decisions because I was afraid I would not have a job. I was afraid to be marginalized. I was afraid to not have the life I wanted. And if I had been less fearful, I would probably have taken different decisions.
Yeah,
I absolutely endorse that answer, Fabrice. I thought you put that so beautifully. I feel like I would love to, I would just basically endorse it. I can imagine kind of like my daddy's self going back to my twink self, and sort of having this conversation. And I would say exactly what Fabrice has said, which is kind of, live your life with less fear. When you are, I am from a very working class background in Britain. I'm not from a rich area because of the classism of Britain. Britain is a very classist country. A lot of doors were shut to me in Britain because of who I am. And because I was very young, you know, I had small horizons. I didn't see the opportunities that were there. And so I think that the kind of going back and saying, you know, don't have the fear of this and look beyond those horizons, I think is just exactly the kind of thing that would have encouraged me to do what I did, I think, in essence, but kind of sooner and with feeling and with more empowerment than I kind of rattled through in a muddle as most people do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is great advice, both of you, and definitely something that I will be keeping in mind as I graduate, go out into the workforce. Now, another question for you both that I'm thinking about, and I'm sure many people at Fletcher are thinking about, because part of the reason why many of us study international relations is we love to travel. How do you navigate your LGBTQ identity while traveling or working abroad? Now, of course, this is very context specific, but anything that either of you would share on this matter, and I'm sure my colleagues would find very useful.
You know, there is a blessing to be LGBTQ, which is that you can tap into a community wherever you go. I remember when I first worked on LGBT issues at the World Bank, you know, people really felt that there were more gay people in the West than there were in the global South. And so I remember there's someone from Google that came and he was looking at metadata. And he had a graph that shows the incidence of porn search, gay porn search versus straight porn search. And he showed that pretty much it was the same everywhere in the world. And that was very eye-opening to my colleagues, because it meant that same-sex attraction was prevalent almost everywhere in the world, right? Of course, based on the filter, there was a bit of difference, but it was pretty much the same. And so wherever I went, I usually would try to find out what were the LGBT spot or get an introduction to another LGBTQ plus person. And that led me to discover the countries I traveled to when I was working for the World Bank or the United Nations in a complete different way, right? My straight colleagues would go through the beaten path, and I would get a guide to the real, you know, Tunis or the real Tokyo, and for that I'm extremely grateful. I have to tell you, I went back in the closet a few times. I did cover Yemen for a while when I was at the World Bank, and it felt impossible for me to talk even to my colleagues about being gay without feeling it was too much and it would be too uncomfortable. And I also covered Central Asia for 4 years. And I have to tell you, I was a bit terrified of the men. It was a very man-oriented culture, a lot of drinking. And I didn't really want people to know that I was gay. So I did come back in the closet with my counterparts when I was covering Central Asia. However, I was out with my colleagues in Central Asia, you know, in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, and they were very welcoming and supportive. But when I would meet with a counterpart, if the conversation would come to my family life, I would try to evade the topic. You know, I remain a bit fearful if I am in a straight environment. I remain always a bit fearful to be perceived as a lesser or a less worthy human being. And so I always have that bit of a chip on my shoulder in which I decide when I am comfortable being out and when I decide to glaze over my family life. I'm not always the out, proud man that I am in some settings.
Thank you, Fabrice. Yeah, I think we all choose the moments when we feel most comfortable to bring our full selves to the table, and that varies.
I think that's exactly right. I think we have to be contextual about what we're doing. I think you know, I think that firstly, when I travel, and I travel a great deal, The first thing that I travel with is humility. I'm the citizen of a former colonial power. And when I encounter homophobia in other cultures, quite often that homophobia comes from the legacy of colonialism. And we often sort of see, when we sort of think about where is progressive and when isn't, you know, this is because of a rich history and a complex history of colonization and power and disempowerment. So one of the things I always try to do is bring humility firstly, and to try to understand the unique history, particularly the queer history of the place that I'm visiting. Sometimes that offers me the chance, like Fabrice was saying, to engage in that community, and that can be amazing. Oh my God, the best time I ever had was in a gay bar in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Just absolutely delightful, totally wacky. Plenty of the people in that bar were not out to their families, you know, very diverse group of people. Actually, it just, you know, and I was the one wacky English person, and we ended up just having a conversation. It was very moving, you know. Similarly, in South Korea, when I visited, you know, I went to some bars there and spoke in very broken, you know, we were kind of waving at each other to try to make ourselves understood. This was prior to Google Translate, you know, which is make things so just kind of understanding and hearing a bit about the experiences of the people there was absolutely wonderful for me. And, you know, trying to take that, you know, try to take my learning from being in those environments and try to see how I can support activists in those communities. And, you know, how can I further advance the causes of queer liberation in other environments that are not me taking my own culture and stamping it on someone else's, or forcing other cultures to act in ways that come from mine. So, you know, that's where I'm traveling. I'm always traveling, you know, I'm traveling as an educator, sometimes as a tourist, you know, often as a scientist, you know, like I see my role when I'm traveling as someone to help empower the people who are living there and the queer people who are living there in a way that is meaningful for them if they choose to engage it. But like Fabrice, you know, I've been to places where it felt that there wasn't an opportunity for that engagement. And so I didn't, and that was okay too. So I think that kind of is complementing the other answer quite nicely.
Absolutely. And Tim, I want to thank you for bringing up the weight that colonialism carried when it comes to homophobia and transphobia. I feel like that's something that is not taught in the US, that Americans are often not aware of, and we have strongly held views about other countries and what we think their attitude may be towards the LGBTQ community. In
Britain, in history class, all I learned about was the Second World War and the Industrial Revolution. At no point was it mentioned that Israel was created by the United Kingdom. At no point was it mentioned that India was part of the British Empire. Like, at no point was any of this even mentioned. And so as an adult, I have found it necessary to understand this history and to engage with this history. I wasn't born, I wasn't responsible for the decisions that were made, but I am surrounded by this legacy, and I have a duty as a human being to help unpack and move on from these terrible things. You know, how else can we make progress?
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more prepared question before we move on to audience Q&A. So in our last 5 minutes before audience Q&A, I'll ask you both, why is LGBTQ representation in your field, so the field of physics, the field of international relations and international business, why is that important to you? Why is that something that you work so hard to advocate for?
Well, I'll start with that with a very simple answer, that almost everyone I know who has been queer in physics has gone. They've left. They've gone on to some other profession. And that, I think, is just profoundly sad. I think that science is tremendously important for society. I think it does incredible amounts of good. And I think we are losing incredible talent if we are not retaining the very best minds across the whole STEM and STEAM portfolios. So for me, anything I can do to be visible and to help others be visible is just essential to the educated workforce, the great minds that are able to challenge humanity's most pressing issues in a time that is just, as we all know, like incredibly turbulent,
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I will talk about business because I did mention underrepresentation in development organization and the UN system before. I think in business, what is striking is that we have made a lot of progress on rank and file employees, but we are still very underrepresented in the senior management to some extent, the C-suite and the board. In fact, in Fortune 500 companies, we have only 30 seats occupied by 23 people out of 5,670 seats. So that means less than 0.6%. And, of course, there is very big names like Tim Cook at Apple, Jim Fitterling at Dow Chemicals, Beth Ford at Land O'Lakes. But, there is an unbelievable LGBTQ plus talent in business that is untapped. And I think it's a bit of a generational issue too, meaning that a lot of the people that are on the board and in the C-suite tend to be in their 50s and 60s. And as we have discussed with Tim, we come from a generation where people were still in the closet, right? And where, we're meeting a very, very big lavender ceiling. So I have hope that some of it will change over time, but we cannot wait that much. I mean, I love what Tim said about physics. Physics, I mean, I don't know anything about physics. I think I probably flanked that course, but I can see how it's extremely important and we have a role to play in this field. I would say in business, it's the same thing. Amazon is taking gigantic decisions through artificial intelligence that is going to affect our lives as LGBTQ plus people for the years to come. And there is nobody in the boardroom that is representing our voice. Then what it means is that, to be a bit blunt, it's straight people designing a straight world. And if we don't have trans people, if we don't have gay people and lesbian and bi people in the boardroom, chances are that the world that is being designed is not really reflecting our needs. So, I don't really talk about this. What I talk about with business is I say, look, I have incredible talent. People you've never heard about. Why don't you have a look at them and see if they match your needs? But in the back of my mind, I remember that representation is about claiming our seat, claiming our seat at the table, making sure that we are represented when very important decisions are taken.
That is such a great point. I think a lot of us think sometimes, oh, representation isn't enough, which of course it isn't enough, but you have to have representation to influence these very important decisions. So thank you to our panelists for this portion of the Q&A, my selfishly asked questions that I wrote. And if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask in the next 15 minutes, we welcome audience questions.
Or even to share a story or thought.
Really, yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to project and don't use the mic, that's fine. We're a small group, but feel free also to use the mic.
Sure what the Zoom thinks, so.
Oh, okay. Use the mics. Don't listen to me.
Hello, my name is Arno. I'm an exchange student at the Fletcher School. And one thing that really resonated with me was Fabrice's point on how there's like a generational shift in kind of the momentality of coming out in the workplace as well as in your private life. And that's something that I personally, as a queer person, often think about is like, is there still a necessity like for coming out and making this whole like big moment around it?
Does it work now? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, I'll repeat quickly. So my name is Arno, I'm an exchange student here at the Fletcher School. And one point that really resonated with me was Fabrice's point on how there has been a generational shift of how monumental the moment of coming out is. And something that I personally, as a queer person, often think about, is it still necessary to come out, or is it just something that naturally is part of your conversation, that when in a business meeting, you kind of do small talk about your family life, you just casually mention it, or is that also kind of a manifestation of privilege that you no longer need to be like out and proud, and that kind of just makes it harder for people who don't have that privilege because you don't kind of give a platform and provide spaces for that. So yeah, I was just wondering what your take is on that.
Well, I have to say that, this is a great question, because a lot of LGBTQ plus people that are now in business, they said to me, well, why would I join my employee resource group? I'm fine. I don't feel discriminated against. I don't feel harassed. And what I often say is that, first of all, we only have scratched the surface of equality, right? Meaning that there are still a lot of places where we are not represented. There is still some level of lavender ceiling. I just know it because I look at the numbers and we don't make it where we should make it. And then what we should not forget, which comes back to the point of team on the world, right, is that the vast majority of LGBTQ plus people are living horrendous lives. It's true even in the United States, outside of the coastal areas, right? Meaning that they live in poverty, they have been kicked out of their families, of their communities, of their places of worship. And we have a duty, I completely made a place under the sun for myself. I mean, I have, even though there is aspect of my life I'm dissatisfied with, I don't experience homophobia and transphobia. And I don't experience, my children are very supported in the school system. But it's because I live in the Upper West Side in New York, and I am white, and I am educated, and I am. So we should never forget that we have a duty, even when we have created a place for ourselves under the sun, to ensure that our brothers and sisters in small cities in Tunisia also get a chance at a life of dignity and opportunity.
I think that's so right. One of the narratives that is very popular is this idea that progress is sort of relentless and forward. And there's often like kind of this idea, I often hear people saying, oh, but we just have to wait for the younger people to kind of fill the population and things will be better. And the reality is that some of the worst homophobia I encountered actually is from people younger than me. And it was very unpleasant. It was violent, and I think kind of makes one question whether indeed kind of this sort of narrative of progress is actually true. I would deconstruct whether coming out really is a single moment, or is whether it is so much a continuous and intentional set of choices that are offered to us that we may or may not take up. When I give a talk, I often put a little pride flag next to my name. I sometimes put a pride flag in my office. I don't necessarily mention it, right? But people know it's there and they can see it or not see it, So I think that when we live in a just and equitable world, as Fabrice was saying, then maybe we won't need to kind of take action. But if we're lucky enough to be living relatively good, relatively awesome lives, we probably should be trying to help those who are not, who are experiencing, all of these other kinds of discrimination or even violence,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really like what you said about just creating a safe space, even in your office, for students, for colleagues. That must have been what that first student who came to you felt, was that sense of safety, that sense of camaraderie.
And I want to be very clear that I have not, I have blind spots, like I knew when I first became a professor, I didn't understand the very complex issues experienced by other marginalized groups. And I've had to educate myself and learn them. So I think for all of us, it's a continuous process.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Fabrice. Does anyone else have a question they would like to pose?
Thank you
to
for
our
the
panelists?
question. It was amazing.
An anecdote, a comment, a critique?
Hi there, my name is Timothy Berard. I am a program coordinator here in the Office of Student Affairs. I had a question maybe for all of you and maybe even Dean Kite. Is there someone that's queer in your particular field that you were inspired by? Or maybe isn't queer, but inspired you to be in your field? Thank you.
I'm going to sound like I am being flattering Rachel, but I have to say that Rachel was a huge inspiration. And you know, I'm not kidding. I went to see Rachel and said, look, you know, I think there is an interconnection between what we do at the bank and the experience of LGBT people, our clients. And she really encouraged me, while a lot of people at the bank felt it was frivolous, it was undermining the seriousness of the institution. And you know, and she was a very senior member of the bank, and I was a very junior employee, and she was very willing to support me, and so I'm very grateful for that. And I have great memory of her leadership at the World Bank. And I will say a small story that Rachel told me one day, that in conversation with Saudis, I think it was Saudis or Qataris, she would make a point to talk about her wife. And to me, that's something I will always remember, right? Because that's what courage is about, is in the most uncomfortable situation, you try to trigger change by being yourself, by being like, well, I have nothing to be ashamed of. You know, I'm in a healthy adult relationship, and the burden of shame is on you, not on me.
I love that. I think of it as like a constellation of queer angels who are there for me. One of the things, I read Alan Turing's papers. Everyone knows Alan Turing, right? He invented computing, right? Gay. Didn't necessarily call himself gay because of the times, right? He he was not gay in the same way that I'm gay. But in his work, you know, I do mathematics, I do computing, I understand his work, I can read it. And what's fascinating to me is to feel the queerness intertwined with it. You know, as he's asking things like, what is thinkable? What can computers think, right? We're also hearing him like, you know, am I like these other people? How do I tell if the difference between a human or a computer? We hear him kind of engaging with his own identity. It's so fascinating. You can't read Turing, even stuff that looks very mathematical, without kind of understanding his queerness. So that was really inspiring to me. I've also just had the privilege of working with incredible people. Els Long at the University of New Hampshire, Michael Falk at Johns Hopkins, Ramon Barthelemy at the University of Utah, like just incredible, you know, a queer army who are trying to change STEM, you know, and that's what kind of gets me stoked when I'm down.
Such a great anecdote.
Sally Ride, the first woman in space, was queer. Oh my God. The moment I learned that, the moment I met her partner, Tam O'Shaughnessy, like it was just unbelievable. It felt so amazing, actually.
That's so great. Yeah, I love the Turing anecdote because it reminds me of, there's so much great work on queering literally every discipline. And there's great work on queering IR. And if you're ever in a class with Dr. Tyden here at the Fletcher School, you'll read that theory and it just changes your whole perspective on your discipline. Dean Kite, do you want to weigh in on this? No obligation.
There's two. I mean, lots of people the same thing, lots of queer angels, but there is a moment when I remember in the Beijing platform. I told the story on a film actually with the name of which I can't remember now, but it was with Hillary Clinton. But it was the story of the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. And there was a moment in the room, we were negotiating sexual health and rights. and most of us negotiating were well, most negotiators negotiating this were closeted, and then some of us in the NGO community were not. And there was a moment when the negotiations happened, and we basically lost. We got reproductive health and rights, we got sexual health, but we didn't get sexual rights. And there was this moment when they brought the gavel down, and some of the more religious infused delegations got very excited that they'd won this victory. And there was this moment where every queer person in the room made eye contact. And I'll never ever, I mean, even just talking about it now, I can feel it. I mean, I'll never forget that moment. So I think that there's an army of people out there, whether you're out or not out. I mean, you find each other. The second, the Charlotte Bunch, I think Fabrice knows, Roxana Carrillo's wife. So Charlotte Bunch, when I was very young and very young, I mean, I was in my 20s, and I was sort of, I moved to the United States in part, in retrospect, to come out. I don't think it was a conscious thing. And so I'm in New York, and she became sort of like this champion of me, but also somebody from whom I learned a lot. So she's been very important to me all these years. And then I think the other people that I learned from were the extraordinary lesbians in the forefront of the women's movement in Latin America in the 90s and the early 2000s. So most of the victories that were won for all women in Latin America, there were significant women who'd identified as lesbian in the forefront. And I learned a lot of political tactics, political negotiation, how to lead completely double lives, many of them. It was quite extraordinary. Everybody knew, but then you didn't know. And so that kind of presentation I thought was really interesting. So those are some of the people that have been important to me. So there you go.
Thank you.
I have to leave now. Just no disrespect to your question, I'm sorry. But Fabrice, can I just say something about Fabrice? Because he was this, this young, I mean, you were quite junior, right? And you were young as well. And he was pretty fearless. And we had a gay union. And we were sort of fighting for domestic partnerships. That's how old I am. And we got domestic partnership rights. And then we started working on health benefits. And then my wife and I, my wife became pregnant, and we were the first gay baby, I think, it was called first gay in the bank group, and they didn't really know what to do. And we were closely followed by another lesbian couple and a gay couple. So there were like 3 gay babies within like 2 years. And and I was offered paternity leave, and then that was rescinded. And then I was offered adoption leave, and that was rescinded because we hadn't adopted and they really didn't know what to do with me. So I just took a week's leave. I remember that, but I have to say that there's a name for this, and I can't remember the name. But when our son was born, I worked for the International Finance Corporation at the time. I was a vice president. The entire corporation sort of bought him a present, and my office was like full from the floor to the ceiling with cuddly toys. I mean, you name it. And it was, there is a psychological name for this, and I can't remember. My wife would remember, but it was an institutional outpouring of the institution was coming to terms with itself in a new way. And we kind of laugh about how many cuddly toys my son was given. When my daughter was born 2.5 years later, there was a similar, it wasn't quite the same tsunami, but again, it was a way for the institution to somehow come to terms with something that it had previously been ashamed of or whatever. And but it was Fabrice that led the effort then for the rights of gay parents, etc., and changed the institution as a result. So thank you, Fabrice.
That's incredible.
Yeah, well, these stories are just so fascinating and inspiring. I would read a whole book filled with these stories. Someone should write that. But we'll take our last question before we wrap up. We have just 2 minutes, if people don't mind, another 2 minutes.
Yeah,
I'd love to get your
I'll
question.
keep it quick. Just I want to thank you so much for your sharing and the close. The whole process is really beautiful. And I'm from China. I'm second-year mall student, and one of my best friend is a lesbian, and I always think high of her because she kind of have a really settled touch on sentiments, and we can share some really settled emotions and girl stuff together. But I kind of feel shocked, even in this kind of international organizations like Fletcher, like World Bank, there's still some not understanding there. And I just want to know what kind of thing or everyone in any community, no matter where we are going in the future, so what we can do to kind of promote every community to be more inclusive.
Thank you so much. Fabrice, did you catch that question?
Yeah, and and to me, the most important thing is for us to constantly share our individual stories, because people cannot understand what is our experience as people of color, as people that have disability, as gay people, as trans people, until we basically share our story. What I love to say about me being a gay parent is that, sometimes I was vilified. I was vilified in the French press, one time after a speech I gave, about my children. And I was always struck between the gap between how people perceive it and the banality of my experience, right? That if really they were in my home, they would see that there is no difference, that it's extremely banal, right? It's, what am I going to cook for dinner? Oh, my son is sick, I want him to feel better. Like there's really no difference, right? We are all human. We have this very common experience, this aspiration towards dignity, safety, opportunity, right? And that's, we have a lot in common, much more in common than we think. And so the only way we can bridge those prejudice is by telling our stories over and over, so that everybody has a better understanding of what is our experience.
Yeah, I've also found it funny, the banality that you encounter versus the stereotypes that are offered. I was last week at a different conference that I was at. I led a discussion about LGBT issues across cultures, and it was just so wonderful and fascinating to hear perspectives from China, from India, from and just sharing different stories that people had, and observations. Not everybody was queer, and I think the reality is that, depending on how you ask the question, the fraction of the population that is queer in some way, could be anything from, a few percent to as many as 15%, actually, if we look at younger people. But nonetheless, this is always like, a minority. Like, we cannot, in any system, like, enact change without leveraging our numbers, multiplying our power by having allies. So like the number one thing that we need is other people to help us produce more equitable systems. Those of us that have the privilege, like everyone here, of crossing international and institutional boundaries, we have a special responsibility to help be agents for that change, I think. But there's, if you're curious about what to do, I think looking for resources on active allyship that are relevant to your field, I think are, and this might be a good thing that the Fletcher group is going to kind of help publicize.
This is a great action item for us in the future. And I love to end on a note of an action item. Thank you so much to both of our panelists for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and Tim, so nice to hear from you and the world of inclusive physics.
I'm absolutely thrilled, Fabrice, that I get to say I met someone from the World Bank today, and thanks for all the incredible work you've done.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you both for your insights. I'm sure our audience has found them as valuable as I have. And thank you to the audience for joining us and for staying an extra 5 minutes. We appreciate it. All right, have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Jamie, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Ciao.